All right, so we're thinking today and then after the break as well about these topics of poverty, property, and ownership. And property has been a flashpoint for conflict throughout human history, wherever there has been the institution of property. It's an obvious site of inequality, even in contexts where equal human rights are maintained. Typically, those rights don't extend to economic equality. Societies, of course, we do have communist movements that have attempted to introduce economic equality, and small movements that have tried. We looked at Gerard Winstanley, clearly trying to get to radical equality. But certainly our society today is one of rampant economic inequality, which is a source of conflict in society. We've got the super rich getting richer, and with that economic power comes political power, comes a hollowing out of democracy. And it seems that the political will to change this is not present, right? So just to think for a moment to try to get our pumps working this morning about movements that are trying to address economic inequality at present. We might think of the Occupy Wall Street movement back in 2011 that grew out of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and the big bank bailouts, where it seemed to be more concern for saving the banks than for the impact on ordinary people. And the targets of this movement were indeed social and economic inequality, but also corruption, the undue influence of corporations on government, particularly the influence of the financial services sector. And the movement was looking for things like the reduction of this corporate political influence, the forgiveness of debt, the stopping of mortgage foreclosures, and so on. It was an interesting movement, clearly in some senses inspired by various other social movements, including religiously based social movements that had come before. It wasn't a religious or faith-based movement. It did have a commitment to nonviolence. And maybe one of the most distinctive things about it was that it had its commitment to consensus-based methods, really wanted participatory democracy. And the weak side of that was that there weren't clear goals articulated or clear kind of authority responsibility structure for enacting those goals. So we saw the movement essentially fizzle out with a lack of clear victories that they could point to. Well, we might also think of the Poor People's Campaign, which now feels like a YDS thing, right? But it was started by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967. So coming off of some of the legislative victories in civil rights, he felt very strongly that there was a need to address economic inequality, right, through political action. But King was assassinated before this movement could make much headway, and revived then 50 years later by the Reverend William Barber. It is a faith-based movement. It's a interfaith, faith-based movement, nonviolent, nonpartisan, very focused on organizing, so the need to actually build structures of authority and responsibility within communities. And I think it's worth highlighting that it employs a human rights framework. So if you're trying to think about how does it work within the ecology of this country, it uses that language, right? That human rights language, which is so familiar here. So we see this core statement: given the abundance that exists in this country and the fundamental dignity inherent to all humanity, so that the kind of language that we've seen certainly located within the Christian tradition, deep within the Christian tradition, but it's become kind of the common language of human rights enshrined in these United Nations documents and so on. Given that abundance and the fundamental dignity, every person in the United States has the right to dignified jobs and living wages, housing, education, healthcare, welfare, and the right to organize for the realization of these rights. So rights beyond civil rights, economic and social rights, grounded in human dignity, and to be achieved through organizing. So that's, we are fighting for these goals, for some measure of economic equality today, but this is nothing new, right? We can go back to the themes, some of the themes that are central in the Hebrew prophets, right? Our concern for the poor and for oppression of the poor, for disparities of wealth, the Lord entering into judgment on behalf of the poor. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor? So Christian thinkers have long puzzled over both poverty, why it exists and what we can do about it, and property. I mean, it seemed clear there was no property in the Garden of Evil. In the Garden of Eden. So how do we get to property? How do we get to that? Is it natural? Is it sinful? Because it wasn't there at the Garden of Eden, does that mean that it was sinful? Is it a necessary accommodation to human sinfulness? Like, given that we're selfish, we sort of have to have property to deal with that selfishness? Or is it kind of a neutral thing? It's a useful human invention. It helps us meet our needs in a good way. And so it's not natural in the sense that it was there at the Garden of Eden, but it's natural in the sense that it's kind of in accord with just what it is to be human and these basic needs that we have. And it was, therefore, property was a preoccupation of medieval natural law thinkers because they wanted to use the natural law, as we've seen, as a standard for evaluating human law. And they worried that if property wasn't natural, this might mean that property was unjust. And so they really wrestled with this question. How do we, within a natural law framework, situate property? And we've seen this a little bit already in our engagement with Vittoria. We saw how Vittoria is really an important figure for the development of human rights discourse out of Christian natural law discourse. And a key part of the argument that we read was that the indigenous peoples of the Americas have dominion. That's a kind of property right, that they have political rights in their own lands, and this is also economic rights. He argued, as we saw, they have political societies, they have political authorities that have true authority to govern, and they have property relations. He said they own things, and because they own things, the Spaniards can't just take their things, can't just take their lands, can't just topple their rulers. This is a complex thing because he's taking private property to be a human universal, maybe not present in the Garden of Eden, but a human universal. And that means that he's assuming that indigenous peoples have property rights in the same way, essentially, that Europeans have property rights. So there's a double-edged sword to that, right? Imposing a European conception of property on indigenous peoples, in this case, in an attempt to protect their belongingness to the land, right? But by way of attributing a European understanding of belongingness. So natural law reflection obviously is proceeding by trying to abstract in a way from particular social political conventions, right? Trying to not just say this is how Europeans do things, but as a result, there's this potential false universalization that's happening here. And of course, we continue to wrestle with the ways in which European notions of property and land were imposed on indigenous peoples and used also to disappropriate their lands. So this is obviously big landscape background for what we're doing. This session and next session, kind of awkward that it's kind of with the break in between, but hey, we'll make it work. We're considering various Christian conceptions of property, but beyond that, Christian conceptions of economic relations generally. And the kind of the big question is, what is God's will concerning economic relations? How is the already and not yet of God's reign visible in the economic realm? And what should human agency be doing in relationship to God's will and this already and not yet? So how do we situate property, poverty, economic relations in relationship to creation, fall, redemption, eschatological consummation? Where are they situated in that grand narrative? And today we're looking at Luther and Calvin against the backdrop of medieval monasticism, spirituality, natural law, and in conversation with contemporary thinker, Daniel Bell, and an excerpt from his book, The Economy of Desire, Christianity and Capitalism. This is a book from 2012. Daniel Bell is a student of Stanley Hauerwas's. He teaches at a Lutheran seminary, so you can situate already his thought a little bit, just connecting him to Stanley Hauerwas. So I want to pose a question that I'll come back to at the end of class for our collective reflection. So I don't pose it now, so you can kind of be thinking about it while I'm talking here. So remember that we talked at the second class, right? Back to the beginning of the semester in conversation with Robin Lovin about 4 variations on the Christian stance of synergy, integrity, realism, and liberation. So how do Christians meet the reality of the world around them? Seeking synergy, seeking a kind of distinctiveness and integrity, being realistic about the fall, about human evil, or seeking this dramatic transformation through liberation. And so where would you map Luther? And not Luther, it doesn't have to be Luther in general. Luther in this particular reading, right? Calvin, Daniel Bell. Do we get a sense for a kind of spectrum of Christian responses here? We'll delve into this in a moment, but Bell has this notion of the ascetic formation of desire, that Christian life is about reforming, transforming our desires toward God, and he thinks that needs to be the primary way in which Christians engage capitalism. Well, what would that look like instantiated today in our society? What difference would it make for our relationship to capitalism? And how different does that look from what instantiating Luther or Calvin's vision would look like in our context? And then just a quick look ahead. So we'll be looking, when we come back from break, at the papal encyclical that inaugurated the Catholic social tradition. This is Rerum Novarum in 1891 by Leo XIII. So, and also paired with a key text of the social gospel movement. So we're sort of seeing Catholic social teaching and the social gospel movement, which is more Protestant, as kind of hand in hand. These are movements really at the same time responding to the same social and economic pressures. So the social gospel text we'll be reading is by Walter Rauschenbusch. And part of what I want to just seed now before we go on break and before you read these readings is that we will be wrestling with some ongoing moral ambiguities in these. These are progressive movements. These are, you could say, the sort of forerunner of liberationist movements. But the very moral ideals that they are setting out are also bound up with commitments that we might see as warped. And some of the same kind of ambiguity that we wrestle with in Victoria, right? Working so hard to defend indigenous dominion, and in the process of doing that, imposing this European conception of dominion. So to be more specific, Leo XIII is arguing for the dignity of the worker. He's arguing for a just living wage, the same kind of argument that William Barber is making today, right? We need a living wage. But it's bound up with, in Leo XIII, with notions of the patriarchal family. It's headed by a male breadwinner. And the living wage is a wage that you can, as a male breadwinner, support your family on, and that's your duty to support your family. And it's bound up, too, with a kind of glorification of private property and of capitalism, a sort of idealization of the capitalist worker relation as a kind of paternalistic relationship, which is not being critically scrutinized, and which sounds, in fact, much like an idealization of master-slave relations that we see in the antebellum South. And Rauschenbusch, so that's kind of part of what we see going on in Leo XIII. And Rauschenbusch, meanwhile, he's defending the living wage, he's defending labor unions, he's critiquing child labor, but it's bound up with a defense of manifest destiny, defense of the idea that, American Christianity, American liberty is destined to spread around the globe. And it's bound up, too, with hostility to ongoing immigration into this nation. So the good and the bad are bound up together, and we want to wrestle with that. And we want to wrestle with the despair that can come out of realizing that these progressive movements again and again end up being complicit with various evils. And two, that they have limited impact, that we're still fighting for a living wage, right? We're still working on child labor. It was just in the news this week, undocumented children who are doing the worst jobs in our country today, right? So where do we go with this sense of complicity, with these concerns about limited impact? Does it lead to passivity? Does it lead to a focus on individual spirituality? Does it lead to renewed intentionality and learning from the past, right? Trying to learn from what has been gained and what has not been gained in progressive and liberationist movements in the past. All right, I know we're a lot more stage setting than I usually do, but let's begin thinking along with Daniel Bell here. Bell suggests that we consider Christianity and capitalism as fundamentally both about forming desire. Don't get distracted by their differences. They're fundamentally both about forming our desire. And forming our desire, like shaping it, channeling it in certain ways, not repressing it. So he's in conversation with Foucault, with Deleuze, but he says they tend to see Christianity as about repressing our desires. And that's really not getting at what is going on here. So where can we turn to gain insight into how Christianity is actually forming, shaping, and directing our desires? Bell suggests that we turn to monastic life and to the ascetic practices in monastic traditions. And again, here, not to see asceticism as repressive, but to see asceticism as training, right? As almost like an athletic practice that one embraces. Because of sin, desire needs to be healed, it needs to be transformed, it needs to be directed to God and to neighbor. How do we do this? We do it through prayer, through the liturgy, through meditation, through a host of practices. And the basic claim here is that this is going to, or this gets us to think very differently about the economy, or to engage very differently with the economy, to experience the economy differently than we would otherwise. That what we need to do first and foremost is to overcome a tendency to think of a kind of a dichotomy between what's spiritual versus what's practical, what's sort of interior versus what's material. And instead to see that these are always interpenetrating, that the ways in which we live practically and materially are decisively shaped by our spirituality. And this goes along with a sacramental understanding of the world. God reveals God's self, God imparts God's grace through the created material fleshly realities of the world. So turning to God in monastic asceticism is not turning away from the body. It's not turning away from the flesh, from the material world. It is shaping our engagement with our own embodiment. There's always a teleology, a directedness to Christian desire, and it is properly a desire for God. It is also a desire for the neighbor. Again, so it's not turning to God and therefore away from the neighbor, like up and therefore no longer around us. It's turning to the one and turning to the other. So liturgy is front and center for him. It's not changing the subject. It's not, okay, I don't really want to be talking about money. I don't really want to be talking about property. So I'm going to talk about what Christians do when they get together and they're not buying and selling things. No, he thinks this is not changing the subject. This is all about arriving at a right relation to the material realities of the world. And unless we are engaged with that, there's not going to be a proper engagement with buying and selling things and accumulating stuff. And he thinks this is really a lesson that we can learn from monasticism, that it wasn't about fleeing the world. It's about learning to encounter the world in the face of human selfishness, grasping desire, grasping control over others and control over physical resources. So he points especially to Bernard of Clairvaux and to the Cistercians in the 11th century as exemplary sites for this formation of human desire. But he also acknowledges that the Cistercians didn't prove very successful at negotiating the key social economic changes that begin in the late 11th century. We get a rise of a money economy, and that leads to a lot of dislocation. Dislocated peasants who are wandering from city to city have no form of employment. They don't belong to the land. There's nobody there who has responsibility for them. And this was a great source of social unrest at the time. So, what kind of an account does he give? Like, theoretically, they should have been doing everything right? They were engaged in this monastic asceticism. They were healing human desire. They were directing it toward God, and so on. So, what went wrong? And the argument here is that their spirituality was more healed at healing the desire for power than the desire for wealth. So they were very good at healing the knight errant that wanted to go off and do knightly deeds and win glory, trying to heal and transform that. But they weren't very good at trying to heal the kind of distortion of desire that leads to accumulation of profit and getting lots of nice goods to fix up your house. So something new was needed as the money economy developed. And he thinks we find this in St. Francis. Francis renounced entirely the emerging commercial economy and offered a counter-formation of desire. But again, he thinks there's a defeat with the emergence of capitalism. There was not a successful negotiation of this transformation on the part of the church or of the Franciscan movement. So he says capitalism emerged on the back of the church's defeat. The church, not only did the state have to be overrun by the economy, but the church had to be as well. So questions to be asked, like, if he's got the right solution here, what's going wrong with the solution? Or is there something with the proposal here that needs to be tweaked? Essentially, the argument is that church leaders lost faith in the power of these practices to heal desire from avarice, and they shifted to instead trying to harness self-interest for shared profit, shared wealth, which would then, of course, wasn't shared, right? The hope might have been you increase prosperity for all, but in fact you line the pockets of some. So we get the emergence of the Protestant work ethic that serves the advancement of capitalism and the erosion of the monastic ideals. Faith then becomes spiritualized, that practice that is supposed to be an engagement with one's embodiment, with one's holistic engagement with the world and with all things, becomes simply a matter of the head and of the heart, a private sort of thing that you do off over here when you're not in the business of buying and selling and consuming. Participation in the formative practices of the church became a kind of voluntary thing that one did, an optional thing. The divisions in the churches scattered the impact of participation in these forms of discipleship, committed discipleship. And the result is where we are today, where people seek to quench their ultimate desires with material possessions, not realizing that they're really seeking communion with God and with one another. All right, so he really only gestures at the social upheaval of this transition to the money economy, but it was very dramatic. And I want to explore a little bit more deeply the Franciscans and the ways in which they responded as a kind of backdrop then for encountering Luther and Calvin and the ways in which they are thinking about some of these challenges. So it certainly was the case that Francis had one of the most radical responses to the rise of the money economy. And it's interesting to think about his own social location as that movement developed. So he's the son of a wealthy cloth merchant He's a member of this new social class that is starting to have immense social mobility that's based on buying and selling things, right? As opposed to social power that's based on ownership of land, something quite new. You gain wealth by buying and selling things, and you can shift your social position very quickly. And Francis experienced this great sense of tension, what to do with Jesus driving out the moneylenders in the temple, what to do with the rich man's inability to go through the eye of the needle in order to enter the kingdom of God, what to do with the inability to serve God and mammon. So he's stewing over what he takes to be the teachings of Jesus, clearly addressing, he thinks, his own social situation. And monasticism as it existed in his world was not sufficient, he thought, to address this crisis. Why? Because, yes, you'd had a monastic vow of poverty, so in a sense, all monks were poor, but this was giving up personal ownership of property. But the orders accumulated all of that property. So you would bring you'd bring whatever your property, it would go to the order, and these monastic orders were accumulating immense wealth. And so this did not sit well with Francis as he's struggling with a problem of wealth. So he sought to create a movement that would have nothing to do with either money or property, try to completely separate himself from these social institutions. And he understands himself as following Jesus' instructions to his disciples in the Gospel of Luke, that they are to carry no purse, no bag, no sandals. They should just go from place to place. This is really the vision that St. Francis embraces for his movement. And how do you retrain desire away from control of wealth and property? Not by joining one of the existing monastic orders. You have to have nothing to do with wealth or property. How do you pull that off? By begging. You live by, don't have the slide I thought I had. You live by begging for the necessities of life. You do not, you only you only accept what you need for that meal, right? What you need for that immediate, the clothing that you're going to wear that day and until it's rags, right? Until you can wear it no longer. But as the Franciscan movement developed into an order, it became necessary to have others that were engaged in practice. Well, I mean, it was necessary from day one, right? You're accepting alms from other people who are engaged in buying and selling, right? You're somehow benefiting from others who are engaged in practices that you yourself will not touch. And as the movement developed, they had lay procurators. They had people who were sort of not part of the order, but they were closely related to the order, who would take care of these things for the Franciscans. So if you wanted to make a donation, you didn't just put like some food in the bowl of the individual Franciscan in front of you. You could make a donation to the Franciscans, but they didn't own what you gave them, because they couldn't own property, unlike the other orders. So the lay procurators would deal with these things. The Pope was the legal owner of what was given to the Franciscans, and the lay procurators would buy and sell things. So, of course, you could critique this as totally parasitic, or you could see it as a witness to life in the kingdom, right? That this attempt to anticipate what will be possible for all in the full realization of the kingdom, and to anticipate it in the life of a few who could be seen as elevating themselves, therefore, over all others, or could be seen as a kind of saving grace for everyone else in society. So when you, a merchant, give to the Franciscans, you are giving a kind of homage to the goodness of the witness that they are offering. So there was a way in which one could see this as a good for all, and not simply the prideful elevation of a few with their spiritual witness. But this whole movement triggered huge debates within scholastic theology, scholastic natural law, that are referred to now as the Franciscan poverty debates. And essentially the debates centered around the question of whether there was a difference between just using something and owning something. And the Franciscans argued that there was a big difference between just using something and owning something, and that everything that they had, they just used. They didn't own it. And they were authorized by Pope Gregory IX in the 13th century to have these non-members who would look after their material needs, while the friars themselves would own nothing and would only make use of what was given to them. But a series of papal declarations from 1317 to 1323 declared to the contrary, that possession without ownership was a fiction, and that the Franciscans, like it or not, had legal ownership of what they possessed. Like, you can't get out of it, guys. The stuff that's been given to you, you now own, and you have a legal right to it, which they did not want. So this is bound up with natural law reflection, since one of the questions was whether it was possible to live without property, and this led to reflection on, well, what was life like prior to the formation of political communities? What was like? Can we say something about what life was like before there was the institution of property? And the assumption was, given the biblical story that was seen as history to be consulted, the assumption was that originally all things had been held in common. Originally, there was no private property. Originally, historically, there was a historical moment in which there was no private property. But the general natural law view was that private property was not sinful. It was a social invention that was beneficial. So Aquinas, for example, addressing this question, argued that if it were not for property, people would always be fighting to control land and things, and the institution of property made for peace. So he says this is a good thing. It's a good thing given human nature as it is, right? Yeah, we're kind of quarrelsome and selfish and so on. So given that, it's a good thing that there is private property. He also argued that private property encouraged responsibility. It encouraged industry. People take better care of things that are theirs than they do of things that are shared. So we should have private property. We shouldn't get rid of it. We shouldn't all try to be like the Franciscans in their most radical mode. And you'll hear echoes of this argument when we get to Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum is also making a defense of private property along very, very similar lines. Another huge set of debates that intensified over this time were over usury, lending for interest. So there are biblical roots of a prohibition of usury in Deuteronomy, and Jews were, according to the Hebrew Bible, prohibited from charging interest to fellow Jews, but not prohibited from charging interest to others. And Christians absorbed this into Christian self-understanding, so usury was forbidden for Christians from the Council of Nicaea onwards. And this led to the practice in medieval Europe of Jews as bankers, with all the sad things that emerged from that. Right? They were the ones who made the rise of a money economy possible because they were allowed to lend with interest to Christians, according to their own law and according to Christian law. So we get this Christian dependence on Jewish taking of interest, which was in various ways tainted. So Christians, while wanting Jews to lend at interest because they wanted the money economy to expand, at the same time saw Jews as tainted by their engagement in this practice, which was, not a practice to be proud of. So it's very much bound up with Christian anti-Semitism, and I think we probably need to wrestle quite a lot more than we have yet with what it means for the rise of the money economy and capitalism down the line, right, to have been built on the back of Christian anti-Semitism. So this is then backdrop to the Reformation. We have the rise of the money economy, the transformation of medieval monasticism, the introduction of this radical begging movement, but still along the way, the commercial economy is getting up and running, right? And there are people who are making profit, who are engaging in merchant work and so on. So the Reformation is often seen as an important inflection point, shifting from an otherworldly spirituality to one that values ordinary life, as insisting that the counsels of perfection apply to all Christians, that it's not good enough to have some people who are monastics who are living up to what Jesus teaches, but that all Christians should be subject to these requirements. But it doesn't mean that all Christians should leave the world and enter the monastery in order to serve God. Instead, the commitment is to serving God in your earthly vocation. So what does this mean when it comes to commercial activity? How can commercial activity be a vocation in and through which you can serve God? That was a question that had kind of been bracketed in medieval thought by all the worries that went around being involved with commercial activity. It was just seen as something you didn't want to look at too carefully. So Luther is fascinating to look at on this question. We are reading this treatise on trade and usury. It's from 1524, so 4 years after he's excommunicated, if you kind of want to situate it within Luther's career. It's not, you've probably read some Luther at some point. This is not something you're likely to have read. But it's really interesting to see him trying to think his way through these questions. So he wants to distinguish between buying and selling that meets human needs and buying and selling that feeds unbridled desire for luxury, desire for ostentation, desire for profit, right? So the ones who are doing the buying, they want luxury. The ones who are doing the selling want the profit. Both of these are problematic. But buying and selling isn't problematic because it serves human needs. So how do you disentangle these from one another? And he's very concerned with two things in particular. How do you arrive at a fair price? And how do you prevent usury? So how do you arrive at a price which is going to facilitate this buying and selling and meeting of human needs? And how do you prevent usury, which he sees as clearly problematic? You're trying to exploit the other person by charging interest when you make a loan. So when it comes to trying to identify a just price, he thinks, well, you need to look at the cost of the inputs, you need to look at the labor that was invested in it, and you need to look at the risk that's involved in it. And all of those, he thinks, you'll be able to figure out what a just price is. So he's very tempted by the idea of setting prices. Like you're going to have experts who are going to analyze all these things and then set the prices. But he also recognizes that, well, maybe setting prices will not be actually practical. So he just you take the usual price. That will be okay too. The market price. Take the market price. Obviously, he doesn't have the kind of economic understanding that's going to develop centuries later, but he is trying to wrestle with this question of what a just price would be. And then how are Christians to engage in buying and selling? Well, four ways he thinks that Christians can engage in buying and selling, and some of which are really not engaging in buying and selling. So the first would be, well, just allow others to take whatever they need from you. Allow others to steal from you. You're Christian. This is brotherly love. You just let it all be taken. Second, you give freely to anyone in need. It's also clearly expression of Christian love. You just give. Well, all right, then you could lend maybe sometimes it will come back to you, but you shouldn't worry if it doesn't. It's a gift. If it doesn't get returned, it's a gift. All of this sounds very impractical, right? It's let people steal from you, give it all away. Maybe you get it back. That'll be very nice. So he then does arrive at the idea that, well, I guess it's okay for Christians to be involved in buying and selling, but only for cash or payment in kind. Right? No financing, no charging, no interest. And how does he make this argument? He says it's against natural law, it's against the old law, right? The law of the Hebrew Bible, it's against the new law. It's against love of neighbor. Well, can he really mean that Christians are supposed to engage in these four ways of being involved with things? And how could this be practicable? Well, he says, if everyone were true Christians, this would be no problem because there would be no stealing. And everyone would give it back to you. So he's wrestling with the difference between creation and fallenness, right? The ideal would be a world in which there would be this free giving. And it seems clearly this is the kind of thing that Jesus wants for us to do. But we don't live in that world. And so then we get Luther's turn to fallenness, right? There's got to be a strict, harsh temporal government that is going to ensure that people do not steal, that is going to ensure that people give back what has been loaned to them. And he thinks if we've got this harsh temporal government in place, then Christians can safely engage in buying and selling. They're still not allowed to take interest, they're still not allowed to exploit and so on, but we sure do need that harsh temporal government because not everybody's Christian. They might be nominally Christian, but they're not Christian, right? So this is Luther's notion of the two kingdoms theology. Within the kingdom of law, evil is expected. It needs to be restrained by force. And within the kingdom of grace, dramatic contrast with that. Christians freely do good. They freely give to one another. They share with one another. And he thinks that Christians do inhabit the kingdom of grace, and yet they're surrounded by those who are not true Christians, and therefore we cannot give up the kingdom of law. We need the kingdom of law. Compare that with the Franciscan notion, where there's a few people who live out these counsels of perfection. They're kind of leaven for the loaf, and the rest are saved by the sacraments of the church. It's a very different vision here, right? You could say the who's more realistic, right? They're both realistic in different ways. The Franciscans themselves are trying to live out the ideal life, but they don't expect it to be lived out by others. All right, quickly Calvin, and then I want to turn to asking you about synergy, integrity, realism, and liberation, and what Bell's asceticism of desire would look like today. But Calvin. So this what we are reading is an excerpt from the Institutes, his sort of major work, right? First published in 1536, revised again and again and again. And it's a section of this much longer thing on how we must use the present life and its helps. And I selected it because we see here the ways in which Calvin is turning away from a kind of asceticism that regards delight in earthly reality as a distraction from God. And he's pushing back very much against that. So if in the Reformation we see this kind of valuing of ordinary life, here in Calvin we see this as a valuing of the beauty and delight of material creation. Appreciating the taste of good food, he thinks, can be a form of worship. It's a form of appreciating God's goodness, the goodness of all that God has given. So the key question then is, how are things to be used? How are things to be related to? How are they to be oriented to the end for which God created them and intended them? And the answer is not just in seeking to have more and more and more of this stuff. That's empty desire. It's to relate to stuff. It's relate to matter. It's relate to this embodied existence in ways that empower us for our calling. Right? So this Protestant notion of vocation. What is going to empower us to serve God and God's purposes in the way in which we relate to these material goods? we are called, and we will have to render an account for how we have engaged with these goods. And we see here the seeds of a notion that will be developed in the Catholic social tradition of what's called the universal destination of material goods. That is, that material goods are made for everyone. Goes back to the idea that at the start there was no private property. Everything was held in common. That God has made this good earth to serve the needs of all. And so if there is private property should still benefit all. It shouldn't benefit only the one who technically has the right to it. So property rights are not absolute. We can't do whatever we like with something just because we own it. This limitation on what it means to own something, which is sometimes put in terms of stewardship, right? We're stewards of God's and must answer to God. And fundamentally, the idea here is that property should serve the common good. It should serve not just our own private good. All right, so where would you put Luther, Calvin, and Bell? Synergy, integrity, realism, liberation. Anybody willing to venture some placements of them, and or to offer some thoughts on what would it mean? Like, you embrace Bell's vision of the training, the ascetic formation of desire. Since he says it failed, what would it look like to make it successful? How would engaging in this transform one's relationship to material goods? I know we could discuss this more, but we are at the end of the hour. So I would, if anyone wants to hang out and chat about it after class, I certainly have time. But I respect the end of the hour and wish you a very, very happy and refreshing break